everyone. I want to do some sort of review video for the Natural Law of Thomas Aquinas material. This may not be as systematic, I'm afraid, as hopefully the other two reviews were for Kant and John Stuart Mill. It's just a little different. So I want to go over some of the basic concepts and what sort of material you should expect on the exam on Monday. I guess we should start with natural law, which is the center of it. But let's look at this reading, Thomas on law in general, so you have a notion of how his idea of natural law fits into the other types of law that he thinks exist. This is the 1019 reading. Sorry for the delay. So yeah, I mean, the important thing, first of all, I think absolutely essential for the exam is to know that he thinks there are three types of law. For the moment, let's just talk about eternal law, natural law, and human law. Let's ignore his idea of divine law. I think it really helps here. There is eternal law, there is natural law, and there is human law. And it's important to see how they fit together. What is eternal law? Eternal law is basically the intentions of God, divine, what he calls divine providence. God is the ruler of the universe, God's conception of things, what God wants for the world. That's eternal law. It's really basically the idea of providence. And one of the things that I said, I hope that we all understood it already, but I said repeatedly in class, is that if we're talking about God, if we're talking about the mind of God, if we're talking about the intentions of God, the important thing is to remember humility. That is, human beings are finite and weak, but especially that they're finite. And God is infinite. So there's no way that we can hope to comprehend God or his law in its entirety. There's a misfit there. I said some things maybe about the great chain of being, how, we've got God at one end, the perfect being, and we've got maybe inanimate matter at the other end. And we're somewhere in between. We're half animal, half angel, you might say. We are animals, but we are rational creatures as well. We're rational animals. So we can never hope to fully understand God or God's law, but the natural law is our partial participation in God's eternal law. What does he say? It has a share. It means we, the human being, the rationality, has a share of the eternal reason, a share, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act, and this participation of the eternal law in the rational creature is called the natural law. So insofar as we touch upon, through our reason, through our capacity to think, we partially touch upon the eternal law, and that's our participation in it. And human law is the application of natural law to particular situations. Human law is where we try to use the basic principles that we know through the natural light of reason, let's say, through our grasp of eternal law, that is, natural law, our partial grasp of eternal law, to use those principles to try to make moral decisions and to figure things out, particular things. Let's see. So too, he says, here it is from the precepts of the natural law, as from general and indemonstrable principles. Remember, the natural law consists of our knowledge of basic principles of what's right and what's wrong and what's good. Basic abstract principles, general principles, or general rules, let's say. And then it's up to us to apply them in particular situations. This is familiar material to us from reading Kant and Mill. Because what are the categorical imperatives but general rules to follow that need to be applied in particular situations? It's exactly what they are. What is the greatest happiness principle but a general rule that has to be applied in particular situations? So this is no different from that, really. I mean, in that respect, that we have principles or rules which are of a very general nature that you need to use your judgment to figure out how to properly apply in any particular situation. And it's that application in particular situations that constitutes human law. So too it is from the precepts of the natural law as from general and indemonstrable principles that the human reason needs to proceed to the more particular determination of certain matters. These particular determinations devised by human reason are called human laws. So, one of the things I think that you'll see, we see immediately, is how these different levels of law, eternal law, natural law, and human law, build on each other. Eternal law is the absolute foundation. This is a theological concept, as I said in class. A lot of things I said in class that I can't repeat here in a video. But a theological conception, that is, there's the assumption here is that God exists and God has an intention of what he wants of the universe to be like, including us. And that's the eternal law. The natural law is built upon the eternal law insofar as the natural law is just our partial grasp of the eternal law. And human law is built upon natural law insofar as human law is just the attempt to properly apply those general principles that we call the natural law to particular situations. So every level depends upon the level below it. So that's a basic idea. And then we, I think, naturally kind of move to looking at natural law more particularly. What is natural law? Because that's where the real action is, really, is the idea that by nature there are certain basic principles, or by nature or by reason. Let's say that there are certain basic principles of justice, goodness, and decency that are self-evident first principles. It's a mighty big claim. Sorry, it's right here. So let's take a look, Thomas, on natural law more specifically. This is the first reading I gave you, actually. Is this one here, Article 2, whether the natural law contains several precepts or only one. He believes that the answer to that is it contains several, but they're all based upon, they all flow from or are logically implied by one very basic moral precept, and that's the one they're familiar with. Let's make it more readable. I'm sorry, it's so small. The first principle of practical reason is one founded on the notion of good. That is to say that good is that which all things seek after. Hence, this is the first precept of the law, that good is to be done and pursued and evil avoided. So that is the first principle, the first precept, the first rule, the first self-evidently true principle of natural law, that the good is to be done and pursued and evil is to be avoided. The idea is that we know that without proof, that we when we hear that or read that actually spelled out, we just immediately agree, and we find that we've been acting on that principle all our lives, and that that's the idea, that if it's a self-evident first principle, then you kind of know it already. It's just you've never actually spelled it out for yourself. Maybe it just didn't seem worthwhile. So it's obvious. The idea is that it's obvious that if something's good, you should do that, and if something's bad or evil, You should not do that. It's just sort of the most general dictate of practical reason, precept of practical reason of natural law. So that's the basic principle. But his idea is that from that basic principle, other things flow, right? And I think that here we're to that question that I've been emphasizing in class, is that for this principle to be applied at all, to be useful at all, it has to be specified. It's way too general to be useful. And the question that's immediately raised is, what is the good as opposed to evil? How to identify what is good? I know that if something is good, it's to be done and pursued. But how do I know that something is good? And he has an answer to that. It's right here. Since, however, good has the nature of an end, right, of a goal, and evil the nature of a contrary, something to be avoided, hence it is that all those things to which man has a natural inclination, and that's the key, are naturally apprehended by reason as being good. And this is where the theological conception comes in, what I was hopefully emphasizing so much in class, is that here, what's key is that we regard ourselves as created beings, that we have been created by God. So our natural inclinations are not just what we happen to be or what we happen to want, but they are indications of how God made us. And so they are clues about how God wanted us to behave, right? That's the really key thing in this way of looking at morality, is that we can look at our own nature, our own natural inclinations, so-called, and we can read off from that how we're supposed to live to some degree. At least we can identify what the goods are. Wherefore, according to the order of natural inclinations, I'm right here. Whoops. Wherefore, according to the order of natural inclinations, is the order of the precepts of the natural law. Because in man there is first of all an inclination to good in accordance with the nature which he has in common with all substances, with all beings, inasmuch as every substance seeks the preservation of its own being, according to its nature. Like we share with every being, living or non-living, the tendency to preserve its own existence. That's the natural inclination we have. So we can learn from that, right? And by reason of this inclination, whatever is a means of preserving human life and of warding off its obstacles belongs to the natural law. That is, we have an inclination to preserve our own lives. So we can identify, therefore, a good human life. That's our own inclinations tell us that human life is a good. So human life should be protected. Human life should be supported. Human life should be, nourished. It's a good human life. It means basically is that death and suffering is bad, but so that's one, further good or further precept: preserve human life. Secondly, there is in man an inclination to things that pertain to him more especially, according to that nature which he has in common with other animals, and in virtue of this inclination, those things are said to belong to the natural law, which nature has taught to all animals, such as sexual intercourse, education of offspring, and so forth. So this is another way of identifying some of the goods and some of the further precepts of the natural law. We have a natural inclination towards sexual activity or romantic love. So we have a natural inclination to form families, let's say, and that natural inclination to form families tells us the families are good, and that children are good, and that the education of children and the protection of children are. Do you see how the goods are slowly, maybe not so slowly, being identified, and therefore the precepts: protect the family, educate your children, take care of your children, etc. There are goods and further precepts, right? And then we have a natural inclination to know the truth about God and to live in society. So knowledge is a good. So learn and don't be ignorant. Society is a good. Support your community and protect it. So there is a way of going from that very general precept, the good should be done and evil avoided, two more particular things, and that is through looking at our inclinations. It's the only way to do it. This is all held up by the idea that, that our inclinations are reflections of God's will. And without that, it doesn't really mean anything. That's why it's a theological view. It's a view that has to take God into account. God plays a very important role in all this. The further articles here are quite important. Whether the natural law is the same in all men. Yes, he says. Whether the natural law can be changed. No. And, his reasons why. And what's important here in this Article 4 and why he thinks the natural law is the same is that, again, this is in classes I was saying, natural law theory basically says that there are self-evident general first principles of morality that we can grasp. And those are the ones that are the same in everybody. And I gave you some examples. People should be free. Children should be nourished and protected. People should not starve. Things like that. And the idea is, the claim here is that everybody at all times would agree to that. But the differences come in the application of those general principles. The practical reason is busied with contingent matters about which human actions are concerned. And consequently, although there is necessity in the general principles, those are clear. The more we descend to matters of detail, the more frequently we encounter defects. We make mistakes, but also there's legitimate differences of opinion, right? The truth is not known to all as regards the conclusions, but only as regards the principles, which are called common notions. The common notions are the general first principles. It's the particular conclusions where people differ. I was going down over that in class on Friday. I hope that I made my position clear. There may be differences of opinion on how the principles of natural law, its general precepts, are to be applied. But the claim is that we will agree upon those common notions, that they are in fact common, and the differences is in how they're applied. This is a related subject here, whether the natural law can be changed. He would say no, it can't be changed, because it couldn't. If natural law is the grasp of eternal law, well, eternal law is eternal, immutable. It's God's law. So it can't change. But he does say that it can, if not change, he says here it can be added to. Nothing hinders the natural law from being changed in this sense, since many things for the benefit of human life have been added over and above the natural law. Right? But it can't be changed in terms of subtraction. Right? You can add to it principles that become clear as life changes, perhaps, or as we learn more. But you can't take away from natural law. Like, if human life is an inherent good, it always will be. There's nothing to be changed about that. If the education of children is a good, it always will be. If the good is to be pursued and evil avoided, it always will be, no matter what Satan says, right? When he says, evil be thou my good. The only other thing I asked you to read was the thing on theft, property and theft. And I think it's an important thing to read. I won't go over it in details. The video is already too long, but let me just point out a couple things about it. This is our only real example of Thomas, a natural law theorist, looking at a particular issue. And I have a hard time sometimes sort of connecting up the theoretical part with the practical part. However, it is quite interesting. And it's about property and theft, where he establishes, first of all, that it is natural and lawful for human beings to possess things, to have private property, He gives reasons for that. He talks about theft and robbery and asks whether they're sinful. His answer to that is yes, and in every case. And then, perhaps most interestingly, he says that basically it's okay to steal sometimes. And the important thing, of course, is to see where and why and in what cases. Theft, he says, is always wrong, always sinful. But under certain circumstances, stealing or taking another's property is not, properly speaking, theft or robbery. And that's when people are in extreme need. If people are in extreme need and don't have what they need to live, and other people have a superabundance, much more than they need to live, then if those poor people who are in dire straits were to take some of the excess from the people who had the abundance, that would not be theft and that would not be wrong. You can kind of see, if you think about the goods, how you could frame it in terms of the goods. We all recognize, well, he has established that property is a good. Property rights are good. And he's given you the reasons why. So property is a good thing, private property, and respecting people's property rights is a good thing. But human life is a more important good. Right? It's a more fundamental good, you might say. So if I can't preserve both, and I have to choose, that is, if I can't preserve the good of private property and the good of human life, then I choose the more fundamental and important good, which is human life. Right? So if people are starving to death, somebody else owns something and they insist on keeping it, I can take from that person without it being theft, because I have affirmed the greater good of preserving human life through what I take than the lesser good of property rights. That's how I would see it. That's what I think he's doing here, but that's not how he presents it. So I'm not going to make that claim. But he does say, something similar. If the need be so manifest and urgent that it is evident that the present need must be remedied by whatever means be at hand, then it is lawful for a man to succor his own need by means of another's property. A pretty radical, pretty clear statement. So there are goods in the world, and then there are bigger goods in the world. And one of the things that we try to do through making moral judgments is to weigh the relative importance of those goods. And I think that's exactly what's happening here. So that's about all I have to say. I'm not saying that I know this is a long video if you've gotten here so far, but I'm not saying it's exhaustive. You got to do the readings. We were talking about things in class. So this video is not, I think it's helpful to watch it. It gives you a sense of what I'm thinking. But this is not a substitute for reading the texts and for listening to what I'm saying in class. So good luck, everyone, on the Monday exam. I don't think it should be too difficult.